Welcome to chess, ladies and gentlemen. I appreciate you guys coming by very much. The few of you or the lot of you, I'm not sure which it'll be. Anyways, I appreciate you guys very much for stopping by. I did go back in time. We don't really have anything currently going on. So I did go ahead and go back in time. For some reason, I just said, you know what? Let me just get a Rogelio Antonio Jr. Versus Mark Paragua real quick. And I went back to 2002. It's a long time ago for some of you guys out there, but I do have that game. It is coming from the Philippines, the Filipino Chess Championship, also known as the Battle of the Grandmasters. Like I said, 2002. And I did change my chess legend down here. So I have the great Pao Benko. And, he 8-time U.S. champion. He did qualify for the candidates tournament, which is, as you guys know, the tournament that determines who is going to play the reigning world champion. He made it on 3 different occasions, 59, 62, and 1970. The interesting thing about it is he did give up his spot on the U.S. team from the U.S. Point to Bobby Fischer. And that allowed Bobby Fischer to go on and play the 1970-71 candidates, just demolishing the field. And it takes a lot to do that because you're thinking about there are probably 99.8% of chess players who ever play the game who never even get a chance to get into the candidates cycle. So, I mean, just to know that he wouldn't be the best possible person, to play Boris Spassky, and all of the hopes of the United States for the 1972 World Championships was better resting on Bobby Fischer's shoulders. It's insane. To give up your spot, that's craziness. But as you guys, of course, know, the Benko Gambit is named after him. And for me personally, as a D4 player, it's the most, it is completely unsound. It's a forced win by white. But the problem is, between 2 human beings, it is very, very hard to play against. So it is definitely a thorn in the side. But if you guys are ready to go, actually, for my people in the Philippines, I will say magandang umaga, mabuhay to you, ingat lagi, maraming salamat po sa nanonood ng aking mga video, maligayang pagdating sa mga chess, ladies and gentlemen. And if you guys are ready to go, let's hit it. Let's take a look. I think I've talked enough. We do have E4. We got E5. Knight comes to F3. We see knight to C6. And we see D4. So we do have the Scotch game. We got pawn takes D4, knight takes D4. And then we do have knight to F6. And we have the Schmidt variation. Knight takes C6. The pawn on the B file takes on C6. You do see E5. Queen comes to E7, just pinning that pawn down to the king. So you unpin with queen to E2. You do see knight coming over to D5, and you do see C4. So it seems like, man, you know what? I need to move my knight somewhere. But you don't, because you have bishop to A6. And this pawn is eternally pinned as long as the queen sits on either E2 or D3. So you are good to go. That knight is just super safe. We do see B3. We got G6. We see G3. Bishop comes to G7. We see bishop to B2. Castles by black. Bishop comes to G2. And we do see rook A to E8. And, I mean, for the entirety of the time, this knight has been immune from capture, at least by this pawn. Of course, now you do have this bishop on G2. You can take the knight at any time. But it's going to be kind of hard for you to take back after the pawn takes here. And then this pawn is at risk. So we do have castles by white. Bishop takes on E5. Queen takes E5. Queen takes E5. Bishop takes E5. Rook takes E5. And as crazy as it sounds, we are still in known theory as of 2002. There were a few games in the 90s that were played with this same exact variation. And you are giving up an entire piece by black. But it is legitimately sound. Pawn takes D5. You see bishop taking F1, king taking F1, pawn taking D5, and then you do have knight to D2. And like I said, you have given up an entire piece for black. But looking at the situation, it is very unbalanced, but the things that you have to take into consideration are the fact that black does still have both of their rooks, and they are up 2 entire pawns. And, you know, white is down 2 pawns, but they are missing one of their rooks. So it's a situation where you have a rook against the rook, and then you have 2 minor pieces against the rook, which, I mean, depending on the situation, you know, can be compensation. But this position is super equal. If you gave this to a computer, it would literally play it to equality. But it is 2 human beings. So we're going to be able to see, like, you know, who can kind of play their imbalance better. We do see rook f to e8. We got bishop up to f3. Not the absolute best move in the position, but there's a very clear logic behind it. You do not want this rook into e2. If you allow this rook down onto the 7th, you know, you are attacking this knight over here. You know, you have just completely, fully taken over the file. So we do see rook to b8, and this is I think this is the novelty of the game. Okay, I knew that. I accidentally erased my notes, but rook to b8 is the very first time that this move has been seen ever. So we do see rook over to c1, most logical move by white, because you are trying to, you know, you don't necessarily want to trade your rook, but you do want to try to put it on at least a half open file. So rook to c1 makes a whole bunch of sense. We do see c6. And we do see rook to c5. You know, we're trying to activate this rook as much as possible without, like, risking having to trade. Now, if we actually back up, after bishop came to f3, and we did see rook, after we saw bishop to f3, it was actually really nice for black to actually play a5. And this just gets you in a situation that doesn't allow white to improve their position as much as what we actually see in the game. So after the rook would come to c1, you'd see c6. And then after the rook would come to c5, you actually see the in-between move rook to e1 with check, forcing the king to g2. And then the rook would come to a8. And then, you know, the rook is kind of stuck on c5. c6 is going to be coming. You know, after you move rook to a6, of course, making sure you're holding down both of these pawns, d6 is going to come. You know, your knight doesn't really have the greatest ability to get, you know, to a lot of, like, great squares. So, I mean, it's just binding white's pieces up just a little bit. But like I said, we did see rook to c5 in this position. And then now we do have rook to e7. We got a3. Rook b comes to e8. And then we see rook over to a5. So as you can see, compared to what we saw, this is a much more active position for white to actually be in. And they do actually start to be able to kind of, like, you know, produce, you know, some type of improvement for their position. We do see d6 now. We got b4. Rook comes over to b8, and then we do have knight to b3. We see pawn to c5. We see b5. We got d4. So, I mean, black is kind of starting to get their pawns rolling a little bit, but we'll see if it's enough. Knight comes back down to d2. We see rook over to d8. Rook comes up to a6. We see d3. Rook comes up to c6. We see a6. That just actually kind of gives away a pawn. So I'm not really 100% sure what a6 was. It just gave away a pawn, like I said. Rook took on a6. So this starts to kind of swing the advantage to white just a little bit. We do see d5. Rook comes up to c6, and this is pretty much forcing c4 because, I mean, you know, these pawns are actually kind of starting to get attacked just a little bit. And the major issue for black is the fact that now white has a passed pawn on the A and B file. So we do see a4. We see rook. Which one is it? Rook e to e8. We see rook down to c5. We see rook over, and I mean, black really does kind of want to get this rook out of the way. If the rook comes off the board, it will be a little bit easier to push these pawns because the knight and the bishop aren't the best at preventing pawns from advancing. The best thing that you can usually do is kind of blockade them. But that's a little bit tough. So the rook does take on d5. It says if I'm going to go down, I'm going to go down swinging. So we do see c3. We see knight up to b3, and then we see rook e to d8. Rook takes on d8, rook takes on d8, and then we have actually reached a position that if you do want to pause the video and see what is the best possible move in the position for white to play, and it is actually the only move to play. Go ahead and pause the video and do so. Okay, so the thing that you really need to be paying attention to in this position, and in any in-games in general, is the fact that these pawns are on the 6th rank. A lot of the times when you have two connected pass pawns on the 6th rank in an in-game, they are usually completely winning. They can overtake a rook, and they can definitely overtake a knight or a bishop if they're trying to like stop the advance. And the king is like no exception. You know, if it's just the king by itself, the king wouldn't really be able to stop these pawns. But you do have this knight over here. The most important thing that you have to do in this position is get your king into a better position and make sure that the king is not cut off. And king to e1 is the move. So, I mean, I think that it was super logical in this position, but you do kind of have to have some understanding of like the end game and you know, far advanced pawns to really be able to fully understand why king e1 is necessary. And so if we take a sample variation into account, let's say we push c2, you can actually move king to d2, and you have between the king and the knight, you are able to kind of blockade these pawns. So that is just a sample variation, but that's not what black is going to do. Black actually moves over to c8, trying to, you know, trying to put some support behind this pawn if we do push it. And the king doesn't have the ability to step up or step up at the moment. So we do see b6. White has their own pass pawns they're trying to push. We do see rook down to c4. And then we do see b7. And the situation has gotten very dire. And it is actually completely lost for black. Even though you can try to throw in rook to b4, thinking that you might stop this pawn from promoting. You do have the really, really nice move bishop to d5, which holds down this knight and also protects the pawn. But after you see king over to f8, you actually see a5. And the unfortunate thing about the situation is this rook cannot move off of this file because just a simple pawn push is going to promote the pawn. So you don't have the ability to go over to a4 to be behind this pawn. And so this pawn is going to go to a6, and it's basically going to push itself all the way to the finish line. And there is just zero that you can do about it. So it ends up being Malakas C. Mark Paragua in this one. So yes, that is the game. That's game! Anyways, I appreciate you guys very much for stopping by. Maraming salamat aking makaibigan. Makito tayo mamaya. Paalam. And I will see you guys next time.